Ryu, honey, I'm heading out to the gala early to check the arrangements. Lela will stay here to help you with your dinner. Do you need anything before I go? No, my dear. Just enjoy the evening. I'll be here, in the dark. 6 months ago, the underworld held its breath when Ryu Jin-tae's motorcade went up in flames. An assassination attempt left the city's most feared mafia boss blind and bound to a wheelchair. At least, that's what everyone believes. But in a mansion built on blood and lies, sometimes the man who can't see is the only one who truly notices everything. 1 year ago, Ryu Jin-tae was an untouchable king. He controlled the city's docks, its politicians, and a billion-dollar empire built from iron and shadow. At his side was Kim Hye-rin, a woman he believed was his anchor in a world of sharks. She was elegant, devoted, and seemed to love the man behind the scars. But power has a way of attracting parasites. After 2 years of marriage, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted. Hye-rin started whispering in corners, her phone was always locked, and Ryu noticed a new, expensive scent lingering in his private study, a scent that didn't belong to him. He told himself he was being cold, that his lifestyle had made him paranoid. That was until the day he returned from a meeting 2 hours early. He heard laughter coming from their bedroom, arrogant, mocking laughter. He pushed the door open to find Hye-rin in their bed with his youngest lieutenant. Ryu didn't reach for his gun. He didn't make a sound. He quietly closed the door and realized that to truly see who was loyal, he would have to become the one person no one feared, a man who was completely helpless. The fire had been hungry, a roaring beast of orange and black that tore through the armored sedan with a deafening roar. Ryu Jin-tae remembered the searing heat against his skin and the smell of melting rubber before the world went silent. When he finally woke in the sterile, white silence of the hospital, the doctors spoke in hushed, somber tones about traumatic brain injury and optic nerve damage. To the world, and to the vultures circling his empire, the great tiger of the north was now a toothless, sightless ghost. But as Ryu lay in that bed, his eyes bandaged and his body still, he realized that the explosion hadn't just taken his mobility, it had given him the ultimate weapon, invisibility. It was 3 nights after he returned to the mansion that the truth was shared with the only person he felt he could trust. Lela was moving quietly through the darkened master suite, her footsteps a familiar, rhythmic comfort as she adjusted the pillows behind his head. She worked with a gentleness that was absent in everyone else, her touch devoid of the pity or the hidden greed that Ryu sensed in his wife's infrequent visits. Lela, he whispered, his voice raspy from the smoke that had nearly claimed him. I'm here, Mr. Ryu, she replied softly, her hand lingering for a second on his shoulder. Do you need water? Ryu reached up, his hands steady and precise, and caught her wrist. He felt her jump, a small gasp escaping her lips as he slowly reached for the dark glasses that masked his face. He pulled them away, and for the first time in weeks, he let his gaze lock onto hers. His eyes were clear, sharp, and burning with a terrifying intensity. I can see you, Lela, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous velvet. Lela froze, her eyes widening as she stared into the face of a man she thought was broken. She didn't scream or pull away, instead, a look of profound relief washed over her features. Ryu tightened his grip slightly, not to hurt her, but to ground her. The explosion was no accident. It was an inside job, and the person who shared my bed is likely the one who signed the order. They think I am a dead man sitting in a chair, and I need them to keep believing that. He leaned forward, the shadows of the room dancing across his tattooed neck. I need your eyes, Lela. I need you to be my silent shadow. Watch who comes and goes. Listen to the whispers they think I can't hear. Record the names of the men my wife brings into this house when she thinks I'm staring at a wall of darkness. Can you do this for me? Lela looked at him, her expression hardening into one of fierce, unwavering loyalty. She didn't ask about the danger or the cost. She simply nodded, her hand covering his. I've seen how they look at you, sir. Like you're already gone. I won't let them take what's yours. In that moment, a new alliance was forged in the silence of the room. Ryu Jin-tae was no longer just a survivor, he was a hunter. And with Lela as his hidden blade, he would wait until the traitors were close enough to feel the heat of his breath before he tore their world apart. As the weeks bled into a singular, agonizing blur of feigned darkness, the thin veneer of Kim Hye-rin's wifely devotion didn't just crack, it shattered entirely. She no longer felt the need to lower her voice or hide the sharp edges of her contempt. To her, Ryu Jin-tae was no longer the titan who moved markets and commanded legions. He was a breathing corpse, a heavy piece of mahogany furniture that happened to have a pulse. The master suite, once a sanctuary of shared power, became the stage for his daily humiliation. It began with the purging of his identity. Ryu sat motionless, his eyes hidden behind the void of his obsidian glasses, listening to the rhythmic thud of his life being discarded. He heard the heavy sliding of the closet doors and the aggressive rustle of silk and wool. Hye-rin moved through the room with a frenetic, joyful energy, pulling his bespoke Italian suits from their hangers and throwing them into heaps on the floor. "This closet is too small for both of us, Ryu," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that bit harder than any physical strike. "Since you can't see the colors anyway, I'm sure you won't mind if I move your things to the guest wing. Or perhaps the basement. It's not like you're going anywhere." He heard the clatter of his gold cufflinks being swept off the dresser into a cardboard box, followed by the heavy thud of his favorite handmade leather boots being tossed aside like trash. The ultimate desecration, however, came that evening. Ryu heard the door click open and the heavy, arrogant stride of a man who didn't belong. It was Min-ho. The smell of the lieutenant's cheap, ambitious cologne filled the air, mingling with the scent of Ryu's own expensive scotch. "It's a beautiful view from here, isn't it?" Min-ho remarked, his voice echoing with the confidence of a thief who had already moved into the palace. Ryu felt the bed groan under the weight of two people. He heard the soft, intimate rustle of sheets and the sickeningly familiar sound of Hye-rin's giggling, a sound she used to reserve only for him. They didn't just inhabit the room, they colonized it. They spoke of Ryu as if he were a deaf-mute, debating which of his properties to sell first and which of his loyalists to retire permanently. Hye-rin leaned over him at one point, her breath warm against his cheek, and he could feel her mocking smile. "Look at him, Min-ho. The great tiger doesn't even know his own wife is being held by another man 3 feet away. It's almost a mercy, don't you think?" Ryu kept his breathing shallow and his jaw relaxed, though the blood in his veins felt like liquid fire. He memorized every word, every laugh, and every touch, stowing them away in a cold, dark place. They thought they were enjoying the spoils of a dead man. They didn't realize they were merely providing the testimony for their own execution. While the air in the master's suite grew heavy with the stench of betrayal, a silent war was being waged in the kitchen and the medicine cabinets of the Ryu estate. Lela moved through the corridors with the invisible grace of a woman who had mastered the art of being unnoticed. To Kim Hye-rin, Lela was a mere tool, a low-status servant who was too simple to understand the complex power plays happening under her nose. It was this very arrogance that allowed Lela to see the murder being committed in broad daylight. It began with a new vial of supplements that Hye-rin insisted Ryu take 3 times a day. She claimed they were imported from a specialist in Switzerland to aid his nerve recovery, but Lela noticed the way the mistress's hands trembled slightly whenever she handled the bottle. She noticed how Hye-rin's eyes darted toward Ryu's still form, waiting with a predatory hunger for him to swallow the liquid. Most importantly, Lela noticed the change in Ryu. Even though he was faking his paralysis, his breathing became unnaturally shallow after each dose, and his heartbeat, which she checked while adjusting his blankets, was dangerously sluggish. One afternoon, while Hye-rin was distracted by a phone call from her lover, Lela slipped into the private dispensary. She took a small sample of the clear liquid and tested it against a piece of silver she kept in her pocket, then smelled the bitter, almond-like metallic undertone. It wasn't medicine, It was a potent sedative mixed with a slow-acting paralytic designed to cloud his mind and eventually stop his heart. They weren't just waiting for him to die. They were actively eroding his brain so he couldn't fight back if his blindness ever flickered. With a steady hand and a heart hammering against her ribs, Lela began her counteroffensive. She spent her own meager savings to procure high-grade liquid vitamins and a neutral saline solution that mirrored the consistency of the poison. Every morning, under the cover of the pre-dawn shadows, she performed a delicate sleight of hand, emptying the sedatives into the drain and replacing them with the nutrients Ryu's body actually needed. When she brought the tray to him later that morning, she felt the weight of his hidden gaze behind those dark glasses. As she pressed the spoon to his lips, she leaned in close, her voice a breathy whisper meant only for him. "The well was poisoned, sir," she murmured, her back turned to the security cameras. "But the water is clear now. Stay sharp. The tiger must be ready to spring." She felt Ryu's jaw tighten, a split-second signal of understanding. While his wife watched from the doorway, smirking at what she thought was her husband's steady descent into a vegetative stupor, Ryu was actually becoming stronger, his mind sharpening into a razor-edged blade, fueled by the very woman they all chose to ignore. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen as the clock struck midnight, but for Ryu Jin-tae, the darkness was merely a veil he wore to mask his lethal focus. He sat in his usual place, a silent sentinel in a high-backed wheelchair, while the air around him vibrated with the whispered greed of the two people he had once trusted most. Hyrin was sitting at the vanity, the click of her expensive jewelry hitting the marble surface punctuating the conversation like small, sharp gunshots. Min-ho, the man who had once knelt before Ryu swearing eternal brotherhood, was pacing the length of the room with the restless energy of a jackal sensing a kill. "The lawyers have finished the final draft," Hyrin said, her voice devoid of the warmth she used to fake so well. "Once Ryu's thumbprint is on that power of attorney tomorrow morning, the offshore accounts and the real estate holdings will be ours. The board won't even have time to vote before we've liquidated the core assets." Min-ho stopped his pacing directly behind Ryu. The boss could feel the heat radiating from the younger man's body, a physical presence that reeked of betrayal. "And what about the king himself?" Min-ho asked, his voice low and jagged. "We can't keep him as a pet forever. The longer he breathes, the more chance someone from the old guard gets suspicious. I want this finished, Hyrin. I want to walk through the front doors of the syndicate as the master, not as the man hiding in a blind man's bedroom." Ryu's heart beat with a slow, rhythmic precision, fueled by the vitamins Lela had secretly provided, but he kept his exterior as cold as stone. He listened as Min-ho leaned down, his voice barely a breath away from Ryu's ear. "It's simple, really. After the documents are filed, we'll move him to the summer house in Jeju. A quiet, secluded place. We'll tell the staff he needs the sea air. One night, a blind man will simply wander out of his chair and fall from the cliffs. A tragic accident. The world will mourn the fallen tiger, and we will be the ones comforting each other at the funeral." The casualness with which they discussed his execution was chilling, a testament to how completely they had erased his humanity in their minds. Min-ho reached out and tapped the frame of Ryu's wheelchair with a metallic clink. "You hear that, boss? Your time is almost up. You built an empire just so I could inherit the throne. Don't worry, I'll take real good care of your wife." Hyrin laughed, a high, tinkling sound that filled the room with a toxic sweetness. Ryu didn't move a muscle, but internally, he was already carving their names into the ledger of his revenge. He wasn't just a man in a chair anymore, he was a judge, and the sentence had already been passed. He only needed to wait for the morning light to begin the final act of their destruction. The following afternoon, the sun dipped low over the city skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the polished marble floors of the estate. Ryu sat in the solitude of the library, the dark lenses of his glasses serving as a one-way mirror to a world that had forgotten his bite. He heard the distant clatter of the domestic staff in the adjoining hallway, a group of junior footmen and housekeepers who had been hired long after his ascent to power. Without the terrifying aura of the great tiger to keep them in check, their voices were loud, careless, and thick with the poison of disrespect. "Why do we even bother polishing the silver in here?" one of the younger men sneered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The old man wouldn't know if he was eating off a gold plate or a hubcap from the gutter. "He's just a vegetable in a silk suit now." A chorus of snickering followed, a sound that would have once cost a man his tongue in Ryu's presence. "I heard the mistress is already planning to turn this wing into a gym for her new consultant," a maid added, her tone light and mocking. "It's a waste of a good room to keep a ghost sitting in a chair." Ryu's jaw remained relaxed, but his pulse quickened as he prepared to endure the familiar sting of their words. Then, the laughter was cut short by the sharp, authoritative click of heels on the marble. "That is enough," Lela's voice rang out, vibrating with a cold fury Ryu had never heard from her before. "Oh, come off it, Lela," the footman retorted. "It's not like he can hear us. The man is a shell. You're wasting your time playing nursemaid to a corpse. You stand in this house because of the man in that chair," Lela snapped, her voice trembling not with fear, but with righteous indignation. "You eat the food his sweat paid for. You wear the uniforms his power provided. You think he is weak because he is silent? Ryu Jin-tae built an empire while you were still learning to tie your shoes. He has more honor in his smallest finger than all of you have in your entire bloodlines. If I hear one more word of disrespect toward the master of this house, I will personally see to it that you are out on the street before the sun sets." The hallway fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The staff scurried away, their hushed apologies trailing off like retreating rats. Ryu sat in the library, his heart thumping against his ribs with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. For years, people had bowed to him out of terror or greed, but here was a woman who had nothing to gain, a woman who believed he was broken and powerless, standing in the gap to defend his dignity. She wasn't protecting the Mafia boss, she was protecting the man. As Lela entered the room moments later to check on him, her touch on his shoulder was as light as a feather, but to Ryu, it felt like the most solid thing in the world. He realized then that while he had been looking for traitors, he had accidentally found the only heart in the city worth keeping. The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion felt electrically charged, though only Ryu Jin-tae knew why. He sat in his library, the dark lenses of his glasses reflecting the rows of leather-bound books he was supposed to be unable to see. On the mahogany desk before him lay a heavy, antique ledger, a book he had spent the previous night meticulously crafting with Lela's help. It was a masterpiece of deception, filled with coded entries that suggested a hidden offshore account containing nearly $50 million in untraceable liquid assets. It was the ultimate bait, designed specifically for a woman whose greed had long ago eclipsed her conscience. When he heard the familiar, rhythmic click of Kim Hye-rin's heels approaching, Ryu deliberately slumped his shoulders, playing the part of the weary, fading king. He clumsily reached for a glass of water, his hand sweeping across the desk and knocking the ledger onto the floor. It fell open, its pages fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird, exposing the fabricated bank codes right at the moment she stepped into the room. Ryu made a show of groping blindly for the book, his fingers brushing the carpet in a pathetic, searching motion. "Hye-rin? Is that you?" I've dropped something. A private journal." He watched through his veil of darkness as her eyes widened, locking onto the figures on the page. She didn't move to help him. Instead, she stood frozen, her breath hitching as she processed the sheer scale of the secret fortune. After a long, predatory silence, she reached down and snatched the book before his fingers could find it. "I have it, Ryu," she said, her voice trembling with an excitement she couldn't suppress. "Don't worry. I'll put it away for you. You really shouldn't be handling these heavy things in your condition." Ryu let out a soft, defeated sigh. "Thank you, my dear. I'm so tired lately. I think it's time we finalize the transition of the business. Perhaps a dinner? To show the board that we are united?" Hye-rin was barely listening. She was already texting Minho under the table. This was the final piece they needed. A dinner is a wonderful idea, Ryu, she purred, already imagining the life she would lead once he was gone. In fact, let's make it a celebration. We'll invite the inner circle, the loyal lieutenants, and the primary stakeholders. A victory dinner for the Ryu Empire. Within hours, the invitations were sent. Hye-rin and Minho, blinded by the prospect of $50 million, summoned every snake and traitor in the syndicate to the mansion, believing they were gathering to witness the official surrender of the throne. They thought they were the hunters preparing for a feast, unaware that Ryu had simply opened the door to the cage. As Lela quietly moved through the house, preparing the long table and placing the hidden microphones, Ryu sat in the shadows, a cold, satisfied smile touching his lips. The guest list was complete, the traitors were mobilized, and for the first time in 6 months, the tiger was ready to show his stripes. The night of the grand gala arrived with a chilling opulence that masked the rot beneath the surface of the Ryu estate. The mansion's ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive tailored suits, and the low, predatory hum of the city's most powerful elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured light over the faces of syndicate leaders, corrupt politicians, and high-ranking lieutenants, all of whom had gathered to witness what they believed was the final sunset of a dynasty. Ryu Jin-tae sat at the head of the banquet table, a silent, obsidian statue in a sea of movement. Behind his dark glasses, he watched the vultures feed on his hospitality, their laughter ringing out with a confidence that bordered on the obscene. Kim Hye-rin moved through the crowd with the grace of a woman who had already been crowned. She wore a gown that cost more than a small villa, and her smile was a masterclass in performative grief. She paused at the head of the table, resting a delicate, manicured hand on Ryu's shoulder. To the guests, it looked like a gesture of support. To Ryu, it felt like the cold touch of a snake. Beside her stood Minho, his chest puffed out with unearned pride, already acting as the man of the house. He caught the eyes of the other board members, nodding with a silent understanding that the transition of power was only moments away. As the second course was served, Hye-rin tapped a silver spoon against her crystal flute, the sharp, ringing sound cutting through the chatter like a knife. The room fell into an expectant hush. "Friends, partners, family," she began, her voice projecting a fabricated tremor of emotion. "We are gathered here to honor the legacy of my husband, Ryu Jin-tae. As you all know, the tragic accident 6 months ago has left him in a state where he can no longer guide us with the strength he once possessed. It breaks my heart to see the great tiger in such silence, staring into a world he can no longer navigate." She looked down at Ryu, her eyes flashing with a hidden, triumphant malice. "Because the Ryu syndicate cannot be left without a pilot, and because my husband's health requires absolute peace, I have prepared a final declaration. Tonight, with these documents signed and witnessed, I will assume full control of the holdings, with Minho as my primary executive. We will move Ryu to a private facility where he can live out his days in the quiet he deserves." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The traitors reached for their glasses, ready to toast to their new queen. Ryu felt the air thicken with their collective betrayal, the very walls of his home vibrating with the greed of those he had once protected. He remained perfectly still, his pulse steady, listening to the scratch of the pen as Hye-rin prepared to sign his life away. He caught a glimpse of Lela standing near the service entrance, her face a mask of stoic calm, her hand resting on the control panel for the ballroom's massive integrated media screens. The trap was fully set, the bait had been swallowed, and the incapacitated king was seconds away from proving that he had never been more dangerous. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, a suffocating blanket of anticipation as Kim Hye-rin dipped the fountain pen toward the signature line of the takeover documents. Minho stood beside her, his hand hovering near Ryu's shoulder in a mock gesture of comfort that was actually a signal of possession. But before the nib could touch the paper, a sound cut through the quiet, a low, rhythmic tapping. It was Ryu's finger, striking the armrest of his wheelchair with deliberate, military precision. The sound was so unexpected, so authoritative, that Hye-rin froze, the ink dripping like a black tear onto the white linen tablecloth. Slowly, with a terrifying fluidness that shouldn't have been possible for a paralyzed man, Ryu Jin-tae reached up. His hand, steady as a mountain, grasped the frames of his dark glasses. He pulled them away, revealing eyes that were not clouded or vacant, but burning with a piercing, lethal clarity. He tossed the glasses onto the table, where they skidded and crashed into a crystal wine glass, the shatter echoing like a gunshot. The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the elite of the city. The problem with ghosts, Hyrin, Ryu said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that commanded the room, is that they see everything while they wait for their turn to haunt you. Before anyone could move, Ryu gripped the armrests and stood up. He didn't struggle, he rose with the power of a king reclaiming a throne. The room descended into a frantic, panicked murmur as the legendary boss of the syndicate stood at his full, imposing height. Hyrin staggered back, her face draining of color until she was as white as her silk gown. Minho reached instinctively for a weapon he wasn't fast enough to draw, because at that exact moment, Lela struck the final blow. With a sharp nod from Ryu, Lela pressed the master override on her tablet. The massive, high-definition screens that lined the ballroom walls flickered to life, bathing the shocked guests in a cold, blue glow. There was no music, only the raw, grainy audio of security footage from the master suite. The city's elite watched in stunned silence as the screens displayed Kim Hyrin and Minho in Ryu's own bed, their voices loud and arrogant as they mocked his blindness and detailed their plan to murder him at the Jeju Cliffs. Every whispered secret, every kiss of betrayal, and every laugh at Ryu's expense played out in a loop of undeniable proof. Ryu leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, staring directly into his wife's trembling eyes. "You thought I was sitting in the dark, Hyrin," he whispered, loud enough for the hidden microphones to broadcast his words to the entire syndicate. "But I was the only one in this house who could actually see the truth." The documents she had been so eager to sign were now worthless scraps, and the woman who thought she was a queen was now nothing more than a recorded criminal in a room full of people who valued loyalty above all else. The chaos that followed was swift, clinical, and absolute. At a single, sharp gesture from Ryu's hand, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open, and a phalanx of his most loyal enforcers flooded the room. They moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow, surrounding Kim Hyrin and Minho before they could even attempt to flee. Hyrin's screams of, "It's a lie," and "This is a setup," were drowned out by the collective, condemning silence of the syndicate's board members, who watched with cold indifference as she was hauled away. Minho, stripped of his borrowed bravado, was dragged out by his collar, his face a mask of pathetic terror. The room remained paralyzed, the air still vibrating with the shock of Ryu's resurrection. Ryu Jin-tae stood at the head of the table, his presence filling the massive hall with a weight that made the city's most powerful men lower their heads in shame. He didn't look at the traitors, he didn't even look at the board members who had been so ready to sign his life away. Instead, his sharp, clear gaze cut through the crowd, searching until it landed on a quiet figure standing by the service entrance. The ballroom was silent as Ryu stepped away from the table. He walked with a steady, purposeful stride, the clicking of his shoes on the marble floor marking the cadence of a new era. He walked straight toward Lela. She stood there, still holding a silver service tray, her expression a mixture of profound relief and humble stoicism. As he approached, the city's elite parted for him like the Red Sea. When he reached her, Ryu did something that shattered every tradition the syndicate had ever known. He reached out and gently took the silver tray from her trembling hands, setting it aside on a nearby table. He took her hand in his, not as a master to a servant, but as a man to his equal. The room gasped as he led her to the center of the ballroom, under the fractured light of the chandeliers. He turned to face the room, his hands still firmly interlaced with hers. "For 6 months, I sat in the dark," Ryu's voice boomed, echoing with a warmth it had never possessed before. "I sat there to see who would sharpen their knives when they thought I was weak. I spent 6 months looking for a traitor, and I found many." He looked around the room, making eye contact with every man who had wavered in his loyalty. But in that same darkness, I found something I never expected to see. I found a woman who protected me when I had nothing to offer. I found a heart that was loyal to the man, not the crown. He lifted Lela's hand, kissing her knuckles in front of the entire underworld. I spent 6 months looking for a traitor, but I found a queen instead. Lela looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears that she finally allowed to fall. In that moment, the power shifted permanently. Ryu Jin-tae was no longer the cold, solitary tiger of the north. He was a king who had finally found his North Star. As the enforcers stood guard and the traitors were silenced, Ryu and Lela stood together, a man who had regained his sight, and the woman who had been his light in the dark. The era of fear had ended, and the reign of loyalty had begun. True power isn't about who bows to your face, it's about who defends your name when they think you can't hear them. Ryu Jin-tae's journey proves that the most dangerous blindness isn't a physical disability, it's the greed that blinds us to the value of a loyal soul. In our world, people often love the boss, but few love the man. This story serves as a chilling reminder that your darkest hour is the ultimate filter. It washes away the parasites and reveals the true gems. Ryu lost a traitorous wife, but he gained a queen who saw his worth when he had nothing left to give. Loyalty is a rare currency. When you find it, never let it go. If this story of cold revenge and warm loyalty moved you, make sure to like and subscribe for more cinematic tales of justice. Drop a comment below. Would you have the patience to play the blind man to catch a traitor? Let's talk in the comments.